Chapter 3: Difference and Division, the Event and Change. Wait, wasn't there supposed to be some good news in here? Don't worry, it's coming, but unfortunately, things are going to get worse before they get better. There are a lot of divisions in society: left versus right, the often overlooked country versus city, and of course the generational divisions, which I believe are all related. The country tends to be more right wing, conservative, and older, whereas the city tends to be more left wing, progressive, and younger. Although maybe it's middle aged, as apparently young men are becoming more conservative, which is disturbing. I thought we were past this, but evidently we have to fight some of these battles again. Here's where I make the case for millennial leadership. Each generation is a product of its time, shaped by the events of their age. My generation, millennials, were defined by the transition to the new millennium, a literal once in a thousand year event. The year changed from 1999 to the year 2000. It wasn't when we were born, but rather when we began maturing into adulthood. The change taking place wasn't just numerical. We grew up during perhaps the greatest change in human history, the transition to the digital era. For all of human history, technology had been analog. It was gears and moving parts. It gradually transitioned to digital, which is more complex than it appears and can have no moving parts at all. Millennials were born in the analog world. We grew up during the transition and we reached maturity in the digital age. We understand analog tech better than any of the younger generations and typically understand digital technology better than the older generations. We understand both worlds in a way that no other does and possibly ever will again. We are far less susceptible to scams than either the older or younger generations. Obviously, this is a generality and there will be exceptions on both sides, along with the nebulous nature of when generations begin and end. But it is a unique common perspective for us. So, what was the world like as we headed for the new millennium? Were we hopeful for the future? Not really. In the US, there was a presidential election in dispute: Republican George W. Bush versus Democrat Al Gore, which was eventually decided by the Supreme Court in favor of Bush, which changed the course of human history. Instead of a climate change pioneer, we got a guy who bankrupted an oil company. But globally speaking, we were actually predicting the apocalypse. Hey, remember that thing that didn't happen? It was called Y2K, literally for the year 2000. The issue was that when computers were first being developed, they were exceedingly large, ridiculously expensive, and very limited in resources like storage space. One of the ways early programmers made up for the lack of space was by limiting the details of the programming, which they did with the year. They hard coded the first two digits of the year 19 so that it couldn't change. Only the last two digits could. The expectation was that by the time the year 2000 rolled around, the programming would have been updated or superseded by something else. At some point, it was realized that this had not occurred. It was predicted that when the clocks hit midnight and the time changed, the hard-coded 19 could not change to 20 and would revert back to the year 1900. This would cause cascading errors that would effectively kill all digital technology and send us back to the analog era. As you might have gathered from the fact that many young people have never heard about it and a lot of older people have forgotten, the predicted apocalypse did not happen. Not because we were wrong, but because we recognized the problem early enough that engineers were able to find a solution. It was implemented, and the event that occurred was the planned celebration. The defining moment of my generation, the new millennium, began with Y2K, the apocalypse that wasn't, which was followed 1 year later by September 11, the apocalypse that was. Wasn't that just in America? Yes, America got attacked, but the whole world got hit. It was an attack on civilized society. I'm not going to show any images. We know what it looked like. We will never forget. The worst of the event was broadcast live around the world, inflicting a trauma on everyone old enough to remember it. There are adults alive today who were born after it happened. They will never be able to comprehend what the world was like before or just how drastically it changed after. Just like any one of us cannot comprehend the world before we were born. For many millennials, this was our political awakening, and we've watched for decades the catastrophic errors in response to it. September 11 wasn't the end of the world, but it was the end of the world that existed before it. Human culture changed. The world changed. It became a darker, grittier place, the same way it did in World War II. The Holocaust was the apocalypse that changed the culture of the Jewish people. The shame of it was an apocalypse that changed German culture. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were an apocalypse that changed Japanese culture. It's all a matter of perspective. I would argue that Tiananmen Square in 1989 was one such event too. It was an apocalypse for the Chinese caught up in the massacre. For the Chinese government, however, it was an apocalypse avoided. The culture shift was stopped. The government survived. Many will know Tiananmen Square as where the Chinese government sent in the military to break up a student protest and it ended in a massacre. Which is true, but it misses some vitally important context. The student protesters were urban, educated, affluent Chinese, and the government first sent in the police, who were urban, educated, affluent Chinese. Rather than crack skulls, the police recognized the students as their people, their kids, and joined them. This was an alarm for the Chinese government. Western influence was spreading and they were facing a cultural revolution if it wasn't stopped. So they sent in the military, made up of mostly rural, uneducated, impoverished Chinese. The protesters were culturally alien to them, so when they were ordered to open fire, they did. The lesson governments learned from this was the importance of maintaining divisions in your populations, left and right, city and country, divide and conquer. If they're fighting each other, they're not fighting you. You can even use one side to enforce your will on the other, because it's when we work together that we become a threat to them, to their survival. Before I move on to my plea to Americans, I want to mention another event that we successfully addressed, something most Australians are familiar with, the hole in the ozone layer. The ozone layer protects the Earth from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation, and the hole increased our susceptibility to skin cancer. We identified in the mid-1980s that it was being caused by man-made pollution, predominantly by chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. The international community came together through the UN and signed the Montreal Protocol to phase out the use of ozone-depleting chemicals. It worked, and the hole has been recovering since. When we can see the event coming and take appropriate action, disaster can be avoided.